Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. This is the session on pilot schemes, the best way to implement basic income. I'm Carl Wetterquist. I'll be your moderator. We have three speakers, and three speakers who've done work on pilot projects in Namibia and India. They'll all speak, and then we'll have questions from the floor for everyone. So, we will start off right now with Dirk Haarmann of the Basic Income Grant Coalition of Namibia, who worked on the pilot project there. Dirk.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Our topic, the best way to implement a basic income grant. I mean, for one thing, I'm sure with a pilot project, you won't even reach the deputy mayor of Ottobrunn. But besides that, I'm even not so sure whether this is the best way. And honestly, I don't care as long as it's one way and a concrete way of to implementation of a basic income grant. Judging from the experience of Ottobrunn, it has been extremely encouraging and indeed a privilege to have been part of this pilot. And in the following, in our paper, we do not want to repeat the findings on the socioeconomic impact of the pilot. They are well documented and have been presented at BIEN many a times. What we aim to do is to share some of the experience around the pilot and around the implementation. This might seem first like a few stories, but we believe that these stories really matter. We come to implementation, or maybe also the lessons we have to learn for the future struggle. So what I would like to look at is the pilot project community, the big coalition, the international organizations, the Namibian government, and the debate in Namibia, and then want to summarize that. Of white farming community, and the community has been highly fragmented and extremely impoverished, and this has transformed into a genuine community. And I think this is really one of the stories which has been so most impressive. Just what happened when we announced that we would have the pilot in Ottobrunn, a colleague from the German Lutheran church, a pastor, contacted us, and he said, well, in principle, I'm not against a basic income grant, but why does it have to be Ottobrunn? And he said, well, I'll choose my words very carefully. And he said, I see that community like cancer. And I said, dear colleague, you said you choose your words carefully, and you're speaking about cancer like people. What do you do with cancer? You burn it, you cut it out, and yet you're speaking about people. But he said, no, these people are really, they are the scum of people. You can't work with them, they are criminals. So this was the perspective of the white farming community on Ottobrunn. Only criminals, he warned us, don't go there, it's not safe. But also internally, people were the community was highly fragmented. People said they wouldn't visit each other because they wouldn't welcome visitors. Any visitor was thought to be a beggar, begging for some sugar, begging for some milli meal. So the social relations within also were fragmented. And this has grown into a genuine community. And a community which was able to take charge of their own affairs. For example, with alcohol. I mean, many people said, well, if you give people free money, they'll drink it up. And of course, there were some people who went to pubs in the beginning, or shebeens, as there are. But what happened is there was a kind of social control because people were there. The neighbors came and said, if you drink today, I know you're drinking the basic income grant money, and don't come begging to me in the next month. So this enabled the community to sort out their own problems and take charge of that. One other important story with the community has been the organization which then took place. They've elected a big committee, and this has been a genuine process from within the community. where in this big committee, people are represented from the teacher to the nurse to shebeen owner. And this form of organization really has changed the community. But the change did not only happen in the community, but went far beyond that. What was most impressive for me were the outreaches of the community, ordinary community members going out to other cities in Namibia, speaking about their experience. At first, I was one of the people who were really against it, but soon we were proven wrong, because this has been the best and convincing lobby work, that people could speak about the experience of a basic income grant for themselves and could tell their life stories with all difficulties, but really then focusing on the people. One of the challenges in the communities has been that researchers published about Ottobrunn without ever engaging the people. There was one researcher in particular coming from Germany, and he said that he claimed, based on the aggregate figures, income figures, that the people of Ottobrunn had not been poor before the pilot, implying that the malnutrition was out of their own making, that people didn't spend the money correctly. And this was really a challenge and an insult to the community. And when the big coalition, the national big coalition, then intervened and said, well, if you take the aggregate income figures in Namibia, everybody is fine. But poverty you determine on a household basis, not in terms of aggregate figures. This changed then the picture dramatically. But he took it on him. It's his mission to try to discredit the Ottobrunn community. It didn't have a big impact in the political discussion in Namibia, but it certainly had one in the German discussion, because people only read the German newspaper, the Allgemeine Zeitung, which you will be able to see. And then we can get maybe to the next slide. The Namibian Big Coalition. I think part of the success was that it was a broad and biggest coalition since independence. So to bring together the churches, the unions, the NGOs, really a diverse group. And I think for the success of that, we took a deliberate decision not to have the Basic Income Grant Coalition as a legal organization in Namibia. First, we didn't want that the lobby work of the Basic Income Grant is outsourced to one particular organization, but that the mother organizations keep involved and keep the Basic Income Grant alive. And to have an emphasis on collective decisions, on joint execution of tasks of rotation based on voluntarism. This has been key for the success of the Basic Income Grant. Last but not least, the charismatic leadership by Bishop Kameta, who had a good standing within, or who has a good standing within Namibia, played an important role in the advancement of the pilot project. Where are we now? And I think today, as coalition, we are certainly in a challenging situation, because after the completion of the pilot project in December 2009, there's been a shift towards a NGO-style type of organization. The organization has become hierarchical organized. The organization has, the Desk for Social Development, which is leading or which has been coordinating before, now claims to lead the coalition, has increased full-time staff. The focus has been on the organizational funding of the coordinating body rather than on the pilot project. And there had been no audits, and the transparency is currently not there. We had the last Basic Income Grant Coalition meeting half a year ago. So currently we are in an acute financial crisis. Coming to the international organizations. Well, there are positive stories. And for example, the United Nations and the Lutheran World Federation have recommended the Basic Income Grant pilot project as best practice models. There have been a very funny incident, but I think it's a small story, but it's also telling that one morning my wife Claudia got a phone call from Washington, one of the renowned researchers of the World Bank, And she said, well, we hear so much in Washington about Ottobrunn. So I just wanted to call to find out what is really going on. And she asked, do you really give money for nothing? So if you know Ottobrunn, a village that time of 1,000 people, if you have seen it, we felt like Asterix and Obelix, the smallest village, still trying to do redistribution, and Washington is concerned about giving money for nothing to 1,000 people. But they said they were genuinely interested in the outcome and they would follow this, and they have at least officially not intervened in the debate. Differently with the IMF has come into the debate from the beginning opposing the basic income grant, and the debate became clear purely on ideological grounds. Of course, they entered the debate and said it's unaffordable. Okay, and they presented figures of the affordability or of the costs. 2 minutes in their presentation, we could stop them and show them that they made a mistake. They mistaken gross and net. So a basic error, and they had to stop their presentation, admitted that their calculations are wrong. Yet they presented the proven wrong calculations to government, claiming that the basic income grant is unaffordable. Next year, we met again, and we had done more research, and thanks to EPRI, to Ingrid and Mike, who had done a tax effort analysis and had redone more careful modeling of the expenses, we could again prove what the real cost of a basic income grant for Namibia would be. Yet, the IMF again presented the figures which were found to be wrong. We asked them, did you see anything different? Could you find a fault in our calculations? And they said, no, there's nothing wrong. And they said, well, actually, we don't care whether it costs 2 or 3% more in GDP. Listen to that. That's the IMF saying. Whether the cost is 2 or 3% higher or not, we actually don't care. We're against the principle. You can only redistribute up to 0.5% of your GDP and not 2 to 3% of GDP. Brazil is redistributing 0.5%. I think it's now a bit more of GDP. That's the maximum. So, and we said, but have you proven that in any calculations? No, but this is a principle. So it's purely on ideological grounds. This is how they advised also government. We then in a publicity campaign tried to show that, and showed also and said we at least would have expected honest calculations. The Namibian government and the debate in Namibia. Carl, can you just check one? Interestingly, initially government claimed ownership of the idea of a basic income grant, because in Namibia it came from recommendations of a tax consortium. There was a cabinet tax commission which had recommended the basic income grant, or they called it a universal income, might be the same situation like in India, for economic reasons. And so he said, so as churches and so on don't claim ownership, but this is actually a government proposal. But that quickly changed once the IMF came out publicly and claiming with these proven wrong calculations that apparently it is not affordable. The pilot project really changed that, or at least challenged government, and is still challenging government. Even a few months back, one in the Ministry of Finance came to me and said, well, officially I have to be against the basic income grant. Personally, I'm supporting you, but I want to tell you that there is none of the topics within the ministry which we discuss as hotly as the basic income grant. Nearly on a daily basis, we are speaking about basic income grant within the Ministry of Finance. So we have somewhere hit a nerve with a pilot. And Eduardo might be able to tell you about his and Claudia's meeting with the president. When the people of Ottobrunn had asked Eduardo to speak to the president in Namibia and ask him to please come to the village, a demand which they have made many times before, but he had only secretly sent his advisor and never came there in public to talk to the people. When Eduardo asked that to the president, why isn't he going, he completely snapped emotionally and nearly thrown out Eduardo and Claudia altogether. So you see, it touches a nerve. Interestingly, just 2 days ago, when he opened the first SWAPO conference, policy conference in Namibia, he said, he said that Namibia is the most, and admitted that Namibia is the most unequal society in the world, and he admitted that the poverty, this inequality, is not sustainable on the long run. Now they are going out and looking for solutions. Well, we would hope that there would be much more presence than from the Basic Income Grant Coalition. One point was interesting. At some point in 2010, the unions pulled out. After there were negative comments from the president, the union bosses decided to move out of the coalition. But just 2 months later, the honorary members of the unions in a general congress demanded to put it back onto the agenda, and they joined back into the Basic Income Grant Coalition. This is completely uncharted ground in Namibian politics after independence. An affiliate of government would never, and a structure like the unions, speak out against senior politicians, except they did that on a corruption case together and the Basic Income Grant. I think currently where we are at the mercy of politics, because there's not enough pressure from below. So the reality is that it will depend who will be the next presidential candidate. And this, unfortunately, has not much to do with the Basic Income Grant. The one presidential candidate is for it, has always been for it, but the people who are against him are against the Basic Income Grant. So there's no real debate about a Basic Income Grant, and it would depend then who would win that. I think, unfortunately, the incidents in South Africa, the shooting of the miners, are very indicative of the societies we are living in Southern Africa. We are entering Wild West capitalism, and where then even the people who have been shot, the prosecuting authority then tries to prosecute them with an old apartheid law to keep them responsible for being shot. This is much more in the public debate than a Basic Income Grant. I'm afraid that we are at a point of no return where a Basic Income Grant would point to a solution, but if it's not coming quickly, we might have missed that chance. Just to come finally to the lessons, I'll just summarize them. This one. I think pilot projects, especially the lobby work from the community itself, were most direct and highly effective. I think one needs to look at a link between charismatic leadership to have an impact in society, and also technical expertise from within, and research capacity. That needs to go hand in hand, and there needs to be a working together of that. I think one needs a broad spectrum of civil society, join all progressive forces. I think, and that I think we haven't done too well in Namibia. As organization, as Basic Income Grant Coalition, we haven't learned the lesson ourselves so well what the people of Ottobrunn have demonstrated to us. It needs to be grassroots democratic. It needs to be led by the solidarity principle. It needs to be anti-hierarchical. It needs to be people-centered. It needs to be voluntarism and highly transparent. I would like to see really much more of a Basic Income Grant and the principles of solidarity economy linked together, and I would like to know why this is not happening in Brazil. I think we as organizations lobbying for that need to live up to those principles ourselves much more. Not as a precondition for a Basic Income Grant, not to be misunderstood, but I think they need to be together. I think one needs to reckon with the crude neo-capitalist interventions and opposition defending vested interests, like the IMF, very bluntly. And I think you need there's a need for mass movement. The people themselves are important, and together with evidence-based campaign. And I think then pilot projects do have their place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dirk. Okay, next up we have Renana Jabhvala, who is the head of the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, a very large and influential organization in India, and one of the groups backing and running the pilot project in India. Please take it away, Renana.
Thank you, Carl. And unlike the previous speaker, Dirk, this is the first time I'm coming to the BIEN conference and have been very impressed with what I've seen so far. Also, unlike him, we're at the beginning of a pilot project. And although in the panel tomorrow, I'm going to talk much more about the project itself and its impacts and so on. But today I want to especially focus on why pilots are important, which I think is what this subject is about. Let me first talk about SEWA. SEWA is Self-Employed Women's Association. It's a trade union of women in the informal economy. And the informal economy is 90% of India's workers, but they are not organized, and most of the trade unions are actually in the formal sector. SEWA has been in existence for 40 years. This is our 40th year. And today we have 1.3 million members, all women. And who are they? They are women who sell their labor and services, domestic workers, agriculture workers, construction workers. They are small producers, that is, small farmers. They are home-based workers, women who in their own homes are artisans or outworkers. And then there are street vendors. And in India, in the urban areas especially, we have a lot of people selling on the streets. So it's a combination of different types of workers. And SEWA is their union, which struggles for their rights and represents their issues. One of the important issues that of women in the informal economy is that of social protection. Because for workers in India, only 8% have any form of proper social protection. Rest don't have any social protection. And even if one is struggling for better incomes, better employment, unless you have social protection, it all gets drained away. One incident of illness, and our members just go into debt and go into a downward spiral of poverty. Therefore, social protection is very important for us. And the main form of social protection that people in India have, or that the poor people in India have, are through different government schemes. And schemes which are different types of social protection schemes ranging from food distribution to health and so on. Now, government schemes, we are spending actually quite a lot. The amount spent by government in the last 10 years has gone up almost 10 times for social protection. And yet, the schemes are implemented so badly that most of that money which is being spent is not reaching the poor and not reaching the informal worker. So there has been a lot of discussion. We are at a very critical time in India where we are discussing that all this money that is coming from government and going for social protection, how can it better reach? And the discussion is around cash transfers. That is, rather than give food, rather than give a scheme of, say, loans or subsidies, why not just have cash transfers? However, what type of cash transfers? And, should it be conditional? Should it be targeted? So that is the kind of issues that has just arisen in India. And it is being pushed by the desire of the government to see that all that money that is being spent does actually reach. SEWA is running 2 pilots. One pilot is in Delhi. It's an urban pilot and in the city of Delhi. And it is actually a substitution scheme. There's a scheme by which people who are supposedly below the poverty line get food at a subsidized amount, basically grain and sugar. And this scheme is targeted, it is very corrupt, and only about 30 to 40% actually reaches the people who need it. So there has been a push, there has been a discussion that the food scheme, which is called the public distribution system, should be substituted with cash transfers. The other scheme we're running, or other pilot we're running, is a much bigger one. I think it involves 5,500 people who receive cash transfers. It's in the rural areas, and it's an individual, unconditional cash transfer, not a substitution, and it's ongoing. Both these pilots are, what we have tried to do is hand them over to good researchers. And in fact, we are very fortunate that Guy Standing has been the international advisor for this, or researcher for this. And we have a good study team, or research team in India, because as a union, we are not competent to run good researchers. I think what I'd like to now really talk about is why should SEWA, a women's trade union, run a pilot? We see ourselves as a force, or a pressure force, really, for social change. We want to change the society, and it is through the force of our members that we change. We're also, which I didn't mention before, we also come from the Gandhian tradition. From Mahatma Gandhi, we can trace our roots back. And one of the things about Gandhi was that the Gandhian movement is based on truth and non-violence. Now, without making that a very big philosophy, truth to us means something that you have to find out what is really out there, objectively discover what is the truth, what is really out there, not something that people tell you or that's in your own mind. So SEWA has always, before it makes any major change, decided to do some kind of research. We always do a research. It may not be as good as these researches, which are done by researchers and are done, let me get it right, by randomized control trials. But we do always do some kind of research, and only from the findings of those researches do we actually make changes within our politics. Secondly, we think pilots are very important. Why? Because a pilot is an experiment. It lets you get down into the reality and see what really happens. How do people really react? Not what they say they will react, but how do they really react? Now, what a pilot does, one of the important things it does is it looks at prejudices. It deals with prejudices, it deals with the way people think, mindsets, and it also highlights vested interests. I want to give the example of our Delhi pilot, which is over actually, or sort of over. The pilot's over, but the changes are happening. In Delhi, the government of Delhi was finding that the food distribution system was controlled by mafias. And they wanted to move to cash transfers instead of food. The people who were the progressive people, who are our natural allies, actually opposed this. And they set up a right to food campaign. And they said that no, we have to continue with the present system. So SEWA, and we have many members in Delhi, we felt that the present system really did not work. Our members said it's not working. And we thought that we should experiment. We should see what this cash transfer is all about, and maybe it's a way out. And so we thought, you can't just say black or white, yes or no. So we did start this. And we did start the experiment in Delhi. And we met a lot of opposition, as I said, from our natural allies, the Right to Food campaign. There were a lot of prejudices. One was, which I think Dirk also mentioned, that's what they always say about people, is, oh, they won't know how to spend their money, they will use it in alcohol and drink it all up. Then another one is that they will use it to pay old debt. And the third is that the government is not sincere and they will go away from supporting any kind of social protection. We started the pilot. When we started the experiment, we faced a campaign to stop the experiment. However, we also have some grassroots force, so we did start the experiment. And we found that the people who were opposing the experiment actually found out the names of those who were part of the pilot and went to the houses and told them that if you don't withdraw from this, then you will lose all social protection benefits, which was untrue. And then there was a demonstration against us, and there was an actual violence between our members and the Right to Food campaign, but we finished the experiment. And we found that nutrition had improved. We found that the intake of protein had risen considerably. We found that people were spending a lot more in healthcare. We also found that in the areas where this was happening, where our experiment was, the public distribution system miraculously improved itself because they faced this competition. And what is happening now is that that the government of Delhi has taken our experiment and adapted its, or is thinking of or wanting to adapt its policy. We have proposed, rather than just switch over, we should have something called a policy of choice. And the government of Delhi is now going to adopt that policy of choice. So in a way, our experiment was very successful. And also, a lot of the Right to Food campaign began to, or at least the right-thinking people in the Right to Food campaign began to acknowledge that cash transfers was a much better way forward. The second example that I'll give you, and I think that will be the last, is why we find pilots important. The pilot tells you, you may think cash transfers, universal, that unconditional cash transfers are a very good thing, and let's all do it. As I said, there is a lot of thinking within the government and outside about how that cash transfers are a good thing, and of course there's a lot of opposition too. Maybe cash transfers are a good thing, but pilots tell you the real roadblocks and the real difficulties. When we started our pilot in the rural areas of a rather poor state in India called Madhya Pradesh, we found that the government of Madhya Pradesh was extremely positive. Yes, they said, what we found out was that in one village there were 361 social protection schemes, out of which very few actually reached. So they were also keen. They said, if you can convert this into cash transfers, we'd be very happy. What happened is that when we started the experiment, we said, yes, let's start the experiment, let's get cash transferred to everybody in the village. But how do you physically do it? I mean, are we to employ an army of people who would go village to village handing out cash? No, we couldn't do that. So we said we'll transfer through the banks. And the government approved that, they liked that, everybody liked that, except that we found out that only 30% of the women and 50% of the men had bank accounts. So now what do? Now we try to open bank accounts. It took us 6 months of continuous work to try to get every bank account opened. This, when there was complete support from the government, complete support from the Reserve Bank of India, which controls the banks, which is the central bank. And I won't go into the details, but it's about distance, it's about unwillingness of banks to open accounts, it's about not having the proofs. You need 2 proofs, you need an identity proof and a residence proof, and most people don't have an identity or a residence. Well, they have a residence, but they don't have proof for it. And so, what we realized was if we are going to promote cash transfers, we have to promote financial inclusion, what's now in India being called financial inclusion, at the same time, which is that people have to be part, at least through the banks or some other means, of the money economy before we can even begin to talk about cash transfers. And so, ending. What does the pilot do for us? It provides us hard evidence. And something we in SEWA always like is statistics. We really like, we really like statistics. We really like to say 90% of people are in the informal economy. It makes a big difference. We really like to say 70% of people who took cash transfers improved their nutrition. So we like numbers, and even our members like numbers. So it gives us hard evidence. It has a demonstration effect. I think in Delhi and now in Madhya Pradesh, there's a tremendous demonstration effect. The people who receive it, who are part of it, who are part of the problems, they understand what cash transfers really mean. And other people in surrounding villages can come there and look at what is there. And so through this demonstration effect, our membership, our 1.3 million members, can become, go towards political change. It also has a great demonstration effect on politicians who actually see it happen, and not only see it happen, they don't mind so much about whether it happens or not, but they see people being happy about it. And finally, what we have been able to do is open a new dialogue, because there was a dialogue going on in the government circles and between policymakers and academics and government, but there was no intervention from anybody at the grassroots. And so we have been able to open a new space and a new dialogue. And so we have found that this pilot, that pilots in general, and we hope this pilot in particular, because somehow this pilot is creating a huge amount of energy in the policy debate in India. So I hope that we will have some effect and have it quite soon. Thank you.
Our last and final speaker for today is a man who's been called a good researcher. I think it's a very, very good name for a professor, and he's one of the very few professors of economic security there are around at the University of Bath. Guy Standing.
Well, I have the dubious distinction of having been a research assistant to both the Namibian pilot and now the Indian pilots. And I got a little bit worried when I heard Renana say that we're at the beginning, because I have a secret to tell her that we've been working on it for 4 years at the moment. And as she went on to explain, we have generated a lot of statistics. So the first point I would like to mention to any of you here is that if there are any statisticians or good social scientists wanting to do a PhD or anything, that our pilot projects are generating and have generated a huge wealth of statistics that we're currently still analyzing. Now, what I want to do in my few minutes is to complement the 2 previous speakers who have both made fantastic contributions to the development of pilots in their respective countries, and spell out a few lessons that I have learned, and I think all of us have learned as we've gone along, and that are what I regard as the 17 imperatives of pilot schemes. Now, I'll try and get through them as quickly as possible. But the first point I'd like to make before getting to those 17 imperatives is that if any of you are tempted, and I hope you are, to try and get pilot schemes going, there is only one thing you can be absolutely certain about, and that is you will make mistakes. And anybody who pretends otherwise is an idiot or a fraud. So I wish to make that very plain, that all of us make mistakes. Now I think it's a very important phase of basic income and universal cash transfers, because we're finally moving very rapidly from the point of theory and intellectual debate, and our literature is extremely rich these days, to practical implementation and experimentation. And I think that will enable us to see a legitimation both among policy social scientists and, more importantly still, politicians and activists. And I think we're seeing that around the place. Now, pilots can help local authorities realize one very important thing, and that is that they're practicable. They can be done. They can be done. And there are a lot of politicians and bureaucrats who actually need that kick up the bottom to realize that, and it's very, very important. It also helps them because it means modest spending, which can be phased up later. But let me get very quickly to the 17 imperatives. And the first one, if we are genuinely promoting basic income or universal cash transfers, is that the design of the transfer itself must respect the philosophical principles that guide all of us in BIEN. And basically, I think there are 9 features. The first is that the transfer must be in cash or in money form of some sort. The second, it should be universal. That is what we believe in, so that everybody in a community must be the recipient. Third, it must be untargeted, not based on means testing and some definition of the poor. It is not to be targeted. The fourth is it should be unselective, not for a particular group, a social group that we or somebody thinks more deserving than other social groups. That is an important principle, and we have to fight that one wherever we are doing work these days. The fifth, and this is our big fight coming up and right now, but it's coming in spades. It must be unconditional in behavioral terms, because there are lots of paternalists out there, lots of people who want to do these things and introduced all sorts of conditions. That is our primary target enemy at the moment. The sixth is it should be individual, not based on a family unit or a household, but individual. So each man, each woman, and each child, or through the child, a surrogate, a mother, should receive the amount. The seventh point is it should be a regular payment over a prolonged period, not a single grant or one-off, but paid over a regular period. The eighth point, which we've had to wrestle with very much both in Namibia and in India, is that the amount paid must be meaningful and basic and sufficient to allow for a difference. That is very important. We can argue how much that should be, what percentage of subsistence, etc., but it must be meaningful. And the final point about the design of the cash transfer is that there should be no other change of policy at the same time as you are starting the pilot. Now, those are the 9 design things of the cash transfer. Now we get to the 16 other imperatives. Some of them may strike you as obvious. In a sense, I hope they do.
But actually, when you come to do a pilot, they're not as obvious as you may think in advance. Now, I've got a paper, if anybody's interested, going through these points, and I'm going to be very brief because we're a limited amount of time. But the pilot design must be clear and sustainable. You must know why it is you have a particular design and what is it that you are actually testing, and why other designs are ruled out. Now, in the course of our Indian projects, as Renana and I know to our cost, psychological cost, we had to spend about a year discussing issues around the design and the clarity. And we gave ourselves a lot of hard time because we were wrestling with issues that are more complicated than at first appears. The next imperative is that the design must be kept constant. If you start with a design and you've got your pilot and you've agreed on how to do it, you must not start changing it as you go through because you think, this might work and this might work. You'll A, get into a terrible mess, and B, you'll make it extremely difficult to do proper evaluation and proper research. The next one is that the pilot must be adequately large. In other words, the number of people covered must be sufficient. Now here again, I love to argue with Renana because I respect her so much. But actually we've got 3 pilots that we've been handling. She forgot the tribal villages, as Astha would be the first to tell us. We've actually got a 3rd component, and in the process we're covering over 12,000 people. Nearly 6,000 people are getting the cash transfer, and I'll come back to the others who are not in a moment. The next principle is that the duration of the pilot must be long enough to enable the evaluation of the impact, the initial impact, and the behavioral learning and adaptation that takes place. Now, we've had problems with that because inevitably you run into funding constraints, which impose their own disciplines and so on, plus research fatigue because you're generating millions of statistics in the research process, but it must be long enough, and preferably 2 years would be the amount. By the time we're finished, I suspect we'll be there or thereabouts in the Indian pilots. The next one is that the design must be replicable and upscalable. That's an ugly word, but essentially it means that what your pilot is designed to do must be possible to expand it without having to completely redesign the nature of the pilot. I won't go into the details, but that actually has quite a severe implication. The next imperative is the one that is most controversial and has led to some very evangelical debates, and I use that word advisedly. And that is, it is desirable to use random control groups. You're not only trying to map changes longitudinally, what happens to people before and afterwards, so that you can use panel data for that, but you also must have comparison with groups who are not receiving what is called the treatment. Now, this has led to the new evangelical school of what I call the randomistas. The randomistas are those who believe that social policy can only advance through using randomized control trials. Now, we subjected ourselves in the Indian case to saying, yes, we should do randomized control trials, yes, we should be comparing with other groups, but there are certain limitations. The randomistas develop their methodology essentially from medical experiments. So you give someone a malaria pill, you give someone else a placebo, which looks like a malaria pill, and you give someone else no treatment at all, and you compare the outcomes. Now with cash transfers, if you try and do that, you're will run into trouble, much worse trouble than Renana and I have experienced. You may not get out of the project alive, let alone with your brains intact. You have to realize that if I give somebody, you, the basic income, and I don't give your next door neighbor the basic income, he's going to get a little angry at you if you don't share some of it. And you can have retributive justice rather making your experiment rather difficult. So what we did in India is we took random selection of villages, so that everybody in a random selection of villages receives the cash transfer, unconditional, individual, etc., and a set of control villages that had to be randomized, randomly selected from a similar universe. So all the villages we took, the list of villages had to be similar types, and we took a sample of villages where nobody receives the cash transfer. That's not ideal. No randomized controlled trial in social policy is ideal. Again, if anyone tells you otherwise, they're talking religion rather than social science. Now, the next one are very practical. And I urge all of us who are dealing with pilots to respect these that sound fairly simple, but as Dirk and Renana and as myself know, you must respect. And that is, you have to do a very detailed baseline survey or census of your pilot areas before you launch the cash transfer. We did that in our projects, a vast amount of data, and those data have to relate to the hypotheses that you make explicit beforehand. That is also very important, a nut and bolt thought. And the baseline survey must cover all the issues, so that they have to be very detailed. Once you've done the baseline survey, as we will discuss tomorrow and we'll show in the video, you have to have an awareness day or whatever to tell people what is going to happen and allow them to ask questions and so on, but you must also subject that process to you not influencing their behavior. Otherwise you break your own rules, so you have to have independent people there at the same time. The next imperative is that you have to have regular evaluation surveys in both the areas being covered by the pilot and areas that are not being covered by the pilot, and they have to be identical. And they have to be objective, independent, detailed questionnaires, not subjective where the interviewers can influence. So any outsider can see our instruments. They're written down, they're in detail, there's training manuals and things like that, so that any skeptic can be confronted with, this was done by an independent, heavily trained people who were told to apply it in the following way. That has to be a feature of it. Again, it's very, very easy to be seduced by your own pilot, because you want success, and you have to be extremely self-disciplined. The next imperative, and I'm going to be very brief on these, is that you should also use key informants in the area. We are using what are called Anganwadis, who are government-appointed people to give us background information. School teachers, the local authorities, asked structured questions about what institutional responses take place once a pilot is in progress. Then you need to take account, the next imperative, of multi-level effects. When you introduce a universal cash transfer for all people in an area, there aren't effects only for individuals, or even only for households and families, but they're also for the whole community. And your techniques of evaluation have to be designed in such a way that you can at least look at some of those community-level outcomes. I won't go into the hypotheses because I've got just a few minutes left, but I've listed the key hypotheses that anybody, I think, who's got an interest in basic income and cash transfers would regard as a list. We had 17 key hypotheses which we identified before we launched the project, and we had workshops and so on to define the sort of variables we needed in order to test and keep controls for the influence of other factors. Beyond that, then there were a few little practical things. First, and rather importantly, the costing and budgeting of pilots must be very realistic. You have to take account of that bottom line called miscellaneous. Because in the process of doing a pilot, which goes over several years, I promise you, the number of things you didn't anticipate that come up is always very large. And you have to have some thick skin and capacity to respond, and that includes budget realism. The next thing, which I will just mention, is that the sample must be as constant as possible. That means you have to define your universe, your population, at the beginning and stick to it. It's very easy for new migrants who are coming into a village, say, and they say, well, why I should receive a basic income, my transfer. You just have to say, I'm sorry, but that would affect the outcome of the pilot. You can imagine if news gets around that all those villages over there are getting a cash transfer, you could have a flood of people wanting that as well. So we had to impose the rule that it only applied to those who are usual residents at the outset, plus any children born during the course of the experiment. Now, the question of financial inclusion, which Renana has mentioned, I won't go into, but I've got a long section on that. It is important. I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to be very quick on that one. Because the nature of the financial inclusion is also a part of the design. And we have had to wrestle with that in India, and we will talk about it a bit tomorrow, because if you say people should have bank accounts, then you have all the problems that Renana mentioned. If you say that they're going to get it in cash, then you reduce the problems. If you say you're going to pay it through biometric cards, you have different set of challenges, etc. But inevitably, it's going to play a role in the nature of the pilot, and you should take that into account in the design of your techniques of analysis as well. And the final thing I want to mention, which I think makes the Indian pilots, because we've got these 3 ongoing pilots, which makes them unique. I've always argued that basic income alone will not be adequate. You have to have basic income with voice, with representation of people who are given the basic income. Imagine if you don't have voice, then a landlord or a middleman or some strong personality could come down the next morning and very easily take it away. Or a husband could take it from a wife, a father from a daughter. So I've always argued that we should combine voice with basic income if you expect optimum effects. Now that is a hypothesis. I may believe it very strongly, but it's still a hypothesis. And what we've done in the Indian project is we selected, again, randomly, half of the village, I'll go on to that in 1 minute, half of the villages are where SEWA, the collective voice, has been operating for 5 years or more. And the other half of the villages, which get the cash transfer, everybody gets the cash transfer, there is no SEWA operating, there is no collective voice on behalf of the poorest and most vulnerable groups. And what we're doing, and we'll show you some of the results tomorrow, is seeing if in fact there is a difference. And we're also comparing it with a sample of villages where there's no cash transfer, but there is SEWA, It's operating in those villages. And the other half of those control villages are where there's no SEWA and no cash transfers. So what I think we're doing is comparing the combination of voice and basic income with basic income alone and without basic income or voice. And the results are extremely interesting. No doubt, without any doubt at all, we've made mistakes. And these projects, as they evolve, different people will make different mistakes. Hopefully not the same mistakes as we've made. But I believe strongly that pilots are the way to legitimize it, and I think politicians in India are showing a remarkable capacity to listen and learn and want to implement the lessons we are learning. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the speakers. Thank you. Just not getting any sound out of this one. That will be bad. It says it's on mute. Now, 1, 2. Okay. That's good. Great. Thanks to the speakers. Now, we have a minor complication that we only have 3 microphones and 2 of them are hooked onto this podium. I've got to go around and get questions. So the only thing I can think of is maybe you 3 could gather around this podium. Is that okay? You mind? We've only got about 15 minutes left for questions. I'll push it an extra 5 minutes, so but I don't want to take any more of your break than that. Now, and I will use my chair's prerogative to say that there were 5 random control experiments, 5 pilot projects in the U.S. and Canada in the 1960s and 70s, which I had nothing to do with, but I've studied and written about. And I take many lessons from them, but the one I think is really pertinent right now is that you have to control what people focus on when you come out of this, because what happened in those U.S. experiments is they found great results. They found that it lowered infant mortality, that it increased health outcomes, it decreased premature babies, it helped school attainment of children, all these factors, but yet what people focused on was the amount that people worked, and when they found out that the experimental group worked slightly less than the control group on average, even though that was mostly people taking more time to find their next job if they happen to become unemployed, this became the focus, and this became the pronouncement of saying it's wrong. So I want to make sure you guys are doing that. Okay, now I need questions. Okay, this person right here, you guys want to come and gather around?
Yes, it's a question about concept, using concept and rhetoric. Guy, you was saying that you are using the concept universal cash transfers and not basic income. Why? I don't understand your explanation. Is basic income controversial? Or why is it controversial?
Go ahead. Please answer.
Should we take a round of questions first?
No, you want you want it one by one. I was writing it down. I'm taking this one instead of Guy. Because SEWA had started this experiment, and it was us who decided what it is that we want to focus on. I should tell you, SEWA has not been part of the basic income debate, and nor are we are still looking. So we have not committed ourselves to this, and as I said, we don't commit ourselves quickly. We take research, then we consult our membership, and it takes years. We are slow. The reason that we have decided on cash transfers is because the way that the debate has come up in India is, should social protection consist of food distribution, loan subsidy schemes, etc., labor schemes, or should it be the money that is intended for people, should it just be transmitted to them? So the debate itself is around cash transfers. The real approach to basic income is, should those cash transfers be conditional? We say no, absolutely not. Should they be targeted? We say no, absolutely not. And the third is universal, and this is something that Guy and I don't fully agree on. We have a question mark on that, and we have to convince ourselves as SEWA. But certainly untargeted and unconditional is what we believe in. But in India, the word basic income has not yet come in.
Okay, the reason that you should answer right after each question is because I will very often have a long walk to get to the next person. You can talk while I'm walking around. Okay, next person.
Hi. What are the ethical implications of having a fixed-term project? What happens to the people after you kick them out 2 years later? I mean, Dirk's outcome is very sad, instructive. And by the way, on the matter of payments, M-Pesa in Kenya, mobile phone.
Okay, why don't you go first and I'll go second.
Well, yeah, we made it clear to the community that this is just a time which we can guarantee of 2 years. So it ended in December 2009. When we had discussions, long discussions with the community, what to do next and whether they would want to have projects, whatever. They said even at a reduced amount, keep up the universal support. At least some form of security, income security is the most important. And that we managed for another 2 years. And what you refer to now is we are at this point currently, or in April, where there couldn't be a payout. Then 2 months later there was a double payout. But for the past 2 months there's no payout. So I think one needs to take account of that. And I don't like to think of pilots as experiments. I think rather as a pilot of pointing to a national implementation. That's what we are hoping for, that's what we are lobbying for, because I don't like to do experiments with people, but one needs to be fair and frank and upfront that one can only guarantee this as civil society for a certain period of time.
No, you go.
Let me just come back, first of all, not so that Carl's own point is not forgotten. One of the things that when we were developing the project in India is we tried to get as many, through workshops, as many of the skeptics shooting at the idea of universal unconditional cash transfers. The classic arguments that, people will be lazy, they'll spend it on tobacco, etc., etc. And we got all those things down on paper, and we built it into the design of our baseline survey, evaluation survey, so that actually we can preempt some of those questions. But the second thing is to go back to the point you were making about the words. The real issue is this, that the notion of cash transfers has become popular in the mainstream debates on social policy in developing countries. And the classic thing has been in Latin America with conditional cash transfers, CCTs. So we are actually promoting unconditional cash transfers, and it relates to more people more easily. And that is a big advantage. The other thing is the point that Charlie was mentioning about, the danger of saying it only lasts for X months, and then we have to end. Well, I think that most people would prefer to get money for X months rather than none at all, but we made it very explicit at the beginning that it was only lasting for that length of time. And we're doing something, and we've been able to do this because of some extra funding from UNICEF that we are very grateful for, which is that we're going to be doing a follow-up survey after the end of the cash transfers, at the end of this year, to see how people have adjusted back to it. That's part of the post-ending survey. I agree it's not ideal.
I just wanted to, about Kenya and M-Pesa. Actually, we're not able to do that because the central bank has not yet allowed mobile transfers, so we have to do bank transfers.
Yeah. In order to draw robust lessons from the pilot experiment for real-life reform, isn't it necessary to include, or at least desirable to include the funding side, the tax collection side of the scheme and not just the benefit side? Is that possible? Is that desirable?
No, I'm taking it. I think in this particular case, in the India case, our issue is not so much about tax collection as, or not about the Indian government not having the money, but about the money being well spent. So the issue right now is not about not enough government budgets for expenditures. I think perhaps when we come to the advocacy stage, which we have not yet, then we would be talking about the budgets from the government, but at this stage not. But I also want to mention one thing, which, since you mentioned funding, the experiments in India, and we remiss of us not to have done it. The big experiment is being funded by UNICEF, and it took us, I think you were mentioning, 4 years to get somebody to fund it. And so we really are grateful to UNICEF. The Delhi experiment was funded by the Delhi government. You want to say?
I think, Philippe, you're right, but I think it's a limitation of a pilot project. But I mean, we put great emphasis on the local contribution within Namibia, and a third of the money came at least locally from Namibia. But the main arguments against basic income grant are really on the spending side, on the net beneficiary side, and not what would it do to the rich who would have to pay more taxes. So I think, therefore, we focused really more on the expenditure side, because this is where the main attack is.
I remember having read the 2009 Bigman Coalition report on the pilot in Namibia, and it really made me very enthusiastic at that time, and I really thought it made a difference if this was the motto at that time. And it even made me start my own research, secondary research on the data you had in that report. I remember how we were talking on randomized control trials in Sao Paulo 2 years ago, and about new designs and all these things. Now we have 3 other pilots. And still, we are in 2012, and I do not see that Namibia will go to a basic income scheme in the next years. So my question is, these pilots, they are important for collecting scientific data. They are important to get real life experiences. But do they really help us to convince governments, to convince societies to get a basic income grant?
I think they do. I think the strongest lobbying part has come really from the community. We did not have a single person going to Ottobrunn who later on would oppose a basic income grant. And I think they have really drawn away from the focus from politics to real lives. But I think in Namibia what we thought of is it would have needed to be scaled up. Actually, the next step would have been to implement a basic income grant in a full region. And I think that would have maybe created the necessary political pressure so that it comes through. Still, I mean, the pilot is there, the people are there, and as the example of Eduardo shows, it has really touched a chord, and I think it's the strongest way to convince people that they see the life stories of other people. We are not there yet, but the debate is still ongoing, and I think there's a chance. So I would encourage that. I would also say the next step would be to scale it up, to have it bigger and longer.
Guy will say something on India, but I just wanted to say from SEWA's point of view, we obviously, since it's our first experiment on cash transfers, our other pilots that we have done on other things have in fact gone into policy, and we have changed government policies. So I think we have always found pilots very useful.
Yeah, let me supplement that, because I think actually I may be, next BIEN Congress, I may be feeling very foolish for what I'm about to say, but I'm actually feeling very confident that the politicians and the Planning Commission in Delhi are actually very positively impressed by what's been happening so far. And as Renana mentioned, the Chief Minister of Delhi has actually put in the platform for re-election something remarkably like our pilot design as a general policy to be introduced. And at this very moment in the state of Madhya Pradesh, the politicians and the bureaucracy are all extremely positive in their reactions towards it. And we produced a booklet on the issues behind it. And I think that what you really feel in the intelligentsia around Delhi and elsewhere in India, that there's been a transformation in attitudes to the whole thing. So I would be not at all surprised if we'll be moving well beyond pilots by the next Congress. And I say that advisedly because we know how cautious we have to be. But there really is a very strong undercurrent of support for this.
Yeah, very good question. Sorry, I'm here. So the one thing is providing the evidence, and the other thing is making the political change. And when it comes to change, I have two questions actually. From what I understood, reading first of all reports about the implementation of the project in Namibia, and listening to guys standing and the imperatives for the implementation of such pilots, is that voice is actually has a key role in making the transition between the payment and using the potentials of such a payment. And therefore my question would be, could you say a little bit more about the role social service providers or representation had in making people aware of the potentials they have now, what to do with it? From the report in Namibia, for instance, just to give you an example of what I mean, was that women were kind of given advice, hey, you don't have to buy, 20 sewing machines, but 10 would be quite perfect, and then how to make your own little, to realize your wish to be independent economically, but in addition to this, to realize your talents. Could you say a little bit more? Reverend Kamita pointed that out as well, that the faith-based organizations actually were had an intermediary role in making the transition of using the potentials.
Well, I would agree with Guy's argument that the basic income grant needs to go together with voice. But I think what we have seen in Ottobrunn is really that through the basic income grant, people gained a voice. 3 months into the pilot, we were stopped by a farmer saying, I can't get farm laborers anymore because they don't any longer want to work for the $10 they got per day fixing fences. And people got up to the farmer and said, well, you can drop that, I'm not working for that slave salary anymore. So the economic security enabled people to speak out against precarious work situations. And I think that was a lesson. About the amplification of the voice of the people towards national level, I think it's very important, therefore one needs a broad coalition, but I think we have also seen that the strongest voice is still with the community, speaking about their own experiences. I, for one, have been really opposed to putting people onto a podium and because I thought it's unfair. But I was proven wrong. They very articulate, could speak about their life experiences, and I think the basic income round has given them a voice.
Okay, we're out of time, but I'll go just a little bit over here for an extremely brief question and brief answers from this man in the front row.
Okay. Thank you, Carl. Well, I would appreciate if from India, if we could learn more about what was the extent of the experience, if it was, say, in a village, in a municipality, or in what kind of of government, and to what extent it was a civil experience in connection with a certain government unit, and if it was for all the population in that unit. And about Ottobrunn, I think it would be very nice if you could explain, like Bishop Kameta told us, how the Ottobrunn experience, the basic income experience, helped us to better understand the miracle of Jesus, of the multiplication of bread and fish. I found that very interesting and very close to the things that Mahatma Gandhi told in India. And also, since I was there in February 2011, I would like to know how has the experience, is it continuing, to what extent, what has been the payment to each one of the 1,000 people there since then? And when we were at the US BIG in Washington, D.C., and I believe 2008, Guy Stanning told us about what was going to begin. He asked us to contribute to the fund, and everybody did. Perhaps this could be done on Sunday. But you will tell us.
I'll say mine was just a brief question. The Delhi experiment is, Delhi is a municipal corporation, and Delhi has, I think the last census was 18 million people. 18 million? Yeah, 18 million people, of which about 1/4 or 1/3 would be people who 1/4 benefit from the food distribution system. So that's so when the policy change comes, and I'm sure it's about to come, then that's the number who will be affected. The other one is a purely rural area, and that is governed by rural councils. And the third one is a tribal area, which is also rural, but more in the forest, so they are slightly different rules. And as I said, this is SEWA's experiment. I mean, SEWA has taken on this experiment, but it is not only for SEWA members, it is for, like in Delhi, I told you, the policy will change and it will change for all.
Well, thank you for asking me to preach, but I'll resist that temptation. Just on the miracle, I think we really got a new understanding that the miracle is not in the arithmetics here of the feeding of the 5,000, but the miracle is in sharing. And I think this is really what has changed Ottobrunn, where you could see this community grow in solidarity, and that made the change. The unconditional sharing is the miracle. That's also a reason why I'm against randomization, but I think that is the power of the story. Regarding where are we now with the payments, there is still a bridging allowance, which we had hoped would tie over people into a national implementation, but for the past 2 months the coalition has run out of funds. There is still the call for donations, and any money going into or dedicated to that will reach the people. So for us, it would be important to keep Ottobrunn alive. I can only say that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much, and we still have 20 minutes for a break.